Hello and welcome to the penultimate method introduction in the Outcome Mapping Learning Lab 2025 series. And we're very fortunate to have with us Tiffany Fairey, who will introduce Photovoice to us. Tiffany is a Senior Research Fellow, Department of War Studies, King's College London. Her research concentrates on arts-based, community-engaged and inclusive peace building with a focus on visual peace research. She's a specialist in participatory visual methods and Photovoice with over 25 years experience working all around the world. And she's actually founder and former director of the award-winning UK charity called Photovoice, where she pioneered ethical practice and participatory image making. So we have a fantastically experienced practitioner and originator of the method perhaps with us here today. She's an associate at Everyday Peace Indicators, and her work's been recognized with many awards, prizes over the years. So Tiffany, over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard, for the introduction and for the invitation to speak to everyone. It's fantastic to be here. I have been working with Photovoice for far too long, like over 25 years now. But I remain very engaged and committed with the method because I find that each time I'm using it, I'm learning completely new things. So it's a real honor to be able to talk to you a bit about Photovoice as a method, but then also thinking about it in relation to bricolage with other forms of methods. As Richard mentioned, I'm currently based in academia. I'm in the Department of War Studies at King's College in London. My own research is concerned with visual peace. And some of the links that I put in the chat is my current research project, which is called Imaging Peace. And the reason I've shared it is there's lots of case studies on that website, the Imaging Peace website, which is specifically looking at visual methods and participatory visual methods in the context of post-conflict and peace building work. So I'm going to dive right in. I'm really keen that everyone asks whatever questions they want, kind of whenever they want, but also I can't really see the chat. So Richard's going to help monitor the chat. But please do put questions in there and I'll take breathers every now and again to see if questions are coming up. I was going to talk for a bit about Photovoice as a method, and then in the case study show an example of a project I've been working on over the last few years with Everyday Peace Indicators, where Photovoice has been bricolaged with a participatory indicators method. But as a starting point, Photovoice is one of a whole kind of range, spectrum of participatory visual methods. And this word cloud is really giving a whole range of terms that you may or may not have heard of before that are really part of the same family of participatory visual methods. What you find with many participatory visual methods is they've kind of they've emerged and grown out of different sectors. So from community photography to academic social science research to community development, community arts practice, participatory development. So there are all these different kind of applications and versions of different methods that often have their own terminology. So the language can seem a bit all over the shop when you're coming to it from the outside. So this word crowd is really to just capture some of the other terms that are used. Photovoice itself is a kind of distinct method within the kind of family of participatory visual methods. And it's understood as a participatory action research methods in which community members are using the medium of photography. So they're using cameras, but also images and talking around images, sharing images, discussing images as a means to support participatory community development processes, research process, monitoring and evaluation processes. But essentially the process of photography, the process of taking pictures, talking about pictures and sharing pictures comes a means to identify, define, reflect on, and communicate issues that are of importance to community members. And since its emergence, or since it first kind of was coined, it was first coined by a health researcher called Caroline Wang in the 1990s. But you will see the term photo voice being used. If you go online, you're going to find a huge array of resources that has deviated a lot from the original method. So it was Caroline Wang that first coined the term photo voice. And she was a Canadian health researcher that was working in China with women on a women's health project. And she came up, these women that she was working with were all part of village health committees, but were largely illiterate. And she coined she started to develop the method in conjunction with Mary Ann Burgess, who was part of the Ford Foundation, as a means for these women to document and then communicate to policymakers the issues that they were trying to push for change around. So it's always been embedded in a participatory action approach. And when Caroline Wang first coined the term and developed the theory and kind of conceptual underpinnings and theoretical underpinnings of photo voice as a method, she identified these kind of three core goals, that really the method was about amplifying and articulating voices, encouraging processes of critical consciousness. Here, it's key to emphasize how photo voice, in terms of its conceptual underpinnings, is very much informed by Paulo Freire's ideas and participatory PRA methods and theories that I'm sure many of you are very familiar from all of the other methods, your own work, and that you're involved in. So I'm not going to go into depth of that. But it was very much developed partly as a kind of community process where taking pictures on the issues that were important to them became a means for a community to reflect on those issues themselves. So it's partly about creating an internal process where a group of participants can come together, reflect on and dialogue around the issues that are important, but also then use the images to communicate back outwards. So it always had at its heart this agenda to influence policy and enable change through using the images and the testimonies that go with the images to communicate to audiences. Now, when Caroline Wang first dreamt up the method, she very much had in mind policy makers. And when she talks about the method, you go back to the original literature, kind of step one in her photo voice method will be to identify who that targeted audience is. Now, as I said, the way the method has emerged and been applied in various disciplines and in various different contexts, you'll find now that there are lots of different variations and people don't necessarily start with identifying a target audience. Nowadays, people will often work with photo voice in a much more emergent fashion, where you work with participants over time and they will identify their own audiences if they're not in a position to identify them first up front. So as I said, it's this highly flexible method. There aren't fixed protocols as such, even though Caroline Wang was one of the key academic originators of the method. It has also been kind of, I would say, like absorbed into community practice. You'll find historically that there's a strong tradition of community photography practice in the UK and the US and other countries that have very much informed some of the methods and thinking of many of the modern versions of photo voice that you'll come across, as well as PRA methods, Paulo Freire, Robert Chambers, all these kind of ideas. But photo voice has been applied for all sorts of ends. So it's sometimes used as a more traditional academic research method, but it's also been used as a monitoring and evaluation and learning tool for needs assessment, impact assessment, gathering baseline data for community mapping. I mean, I'm not going to read through this whole list, but the list is there to kind of, I guess, emphasize the diversity of approaches and uses of the method. And this largely comes from the fact that it doesn't have these fixed protocols, and that in a way makes it a very exciting method. Can people adapt and reinvent it each time they use it, but also can make it quite confusing when you're coming to it for the first time, because when you start looking around for resources, some people will have, I guess, standardized and made like nice one step, step by step procedures for Photovoice, and others will be approaching it in a much more open-ended way as a kind of emergent, collaborative method that doesn't kind of operate in such kind of, fixed by fixed steps. So depending on where you're sourcing your information around Photovoice, you'll find people approaching it quite distinctly, and depending on how they're planning to use it and to what extent participants and communities are involved from the get-go in terms of how it's used, you'll find some versions of Photovoice are quite researcher controlled, whereas at the other end you see a kind of a much more open-ended protocols. So there's this big spectrum, I guess, in terms of how Photovoice users are interpreting and applying definitions of participation, we could say, which is, common in lots of participatory methods, of course. Now, why Photovoice, I guess, has become very popular and has kind of had this amazing spread and been used all over is very much about the medium of photography itself. It's fun. And while I found, sometimes with a lot of other methods, there might be questions about how to engage communities to use these methods. With Photovoice, that is rarely an issue. It's a very engaging method. People enjoy taking pictures, and people enjoy talking about pictures and looking at pictures. So in that sense, many researchers come to use Photovoice because it's particularly effective at engaging groups that might otherwise struggle to relate to or have, I guess, the kind of energies or interests even to engage with other methods that might be harder to grasp. So in that sense, and because it's very flexible, it can be adapted. So I've worked on a Photovoice project that's lasted an afternoon, and I've worked on one that has run over 10 years. So there are all these different kind of levels and kind of forms of doing Photovoice that can be quite discreet and contained, that are a lot less time intensive for participants. And there are, of course, much longer, more elaborate processes that can unfold over years. Because images themselves have no inherent meaning, there's something very exciting about what can happen in terms of ownership and control, and when communities and participants take hold of the camera. It's up to them to decide what they photograph, and it's up to them to communicate why they're photographing that thing. And in those conversations that happen around the images and as people take charge of the camera, there's really exciting opportunities there to upend some of the power differentials that can exist, because from the outset participants are in charge of what we see, and when they decide what they put in the frame, they're deciding what it is relevant to the particular project or evaluation or subject at hand. So I'm going to keep going because I keep an eye on time. This Photovoice Worldwide is a useful organization for people that want to know a lot more. They are often catering to a more academic researchers who are using the method, but they have a lot of great online recordings, resources. They do training as well. And this Photovoice path was first developed by Laura Lorenz, who's one of the founders of Photovoice Worldwide. And I think it's quite a helpful diagram to talk about the kind of step-by-step of what's happening in Photovoice. So again, I'm not going to talk about this in great depth because we've got limited time, but essentially what happens in a Photovoice process is a group will come together to, they'll be invited to participate first of all. So there's an invitation to a community group, to a group of participants, whereby a Photovoice process is explained, the kind of focus of the project is explained. And once the group of participants have kind of volunteered themselves, signed up, for want of another word, they essentially will start on a series of workshops. And as I said, those could be quite short and discrete workshops. They could be workshops that run over months, weeks, years. But in those workshops, often participants are generating images in response to particular prompts. Now, those prompts might be open-ended, they might be very specific, and those prompts can be set by the organizing researchers or evaluators. They can be designed in conjunction with participants. Photovoice ideally involves iterative processes of picture taking. So over the course of a Photovoice project, you might have a number of prompts. So week one, participants might take pictures. They might just do a kind of a warm-up project, like take pictures that document their daily routine, let's say. I'm imagining it's some kind of hygiene project, for example, that's the focus. So one day they might do a diary, photo diary. The next day they might focus in and just take pictures in relation to their hygiene habits or customs or concerns they have in their community about hygiene issues, for example. So these prompts are often directing participants towards a particular subject that will obviously be the subject of the project or the research project or the evaluation or whatever it might be. So yes, participants go out and take pictures in response to a prompt. Now, ordinarily, those pictures of cameras are taken away outside of the workshops, and community members or participants will be photographing outside of the actual workshop time. But sometimes for safety concerns or whatever, they might not take cameras away. So pictures can be done within the workshop space. And as I said, the picture taking is often happening in this iterative process where pictures are taken, they come back, the pictures are reviewed and discussed within the group. So there's a dialogue and reflection around the images and the issues that the images raise. And then participants might look to write narratives alongside their pictures. So part of the participatory kind of analysis and discussion and reflection process is when all the pictures come back, and participants might select pictures that are most relevant and important to the subject at hand. And in that selection, I guess there's a refining and a further definition of the significance and relevance of the issues at hand, and there's dialogue around those. And there's dialogue that the individual might have with themselves looking at the images, but also there's dialogue within a group, a large group or small group work. And so after there might be various rounds of picture taking, various rounds of dialogues around images, participants might select a core group of images that they want to share with audiences outside. And that's when they might write or dictate narratives to go with the image. Now, photo voice, the word photo voice, it's really important to kind of zero in on the voice bit, because as I said earlier, photos in and on themselves don't tell stories. If I just show you a picture with no context, everyone will have a different version of what that picture is showing them. What is very crucial with the photo voice method is the participants themselves are defining and communicating the significance of that image, and that can be captured through an interview orally, but it's often also written up as a narrative. And that then is what's used when their pictures are shared with public audiences or in policy briefings or in evaluation reports. So capturing and recording these narratives is really crucial. Now, they won't necessarily be writing or dictating these narratives for every single photo they've taken. They will ordinarily be choosing an edit of the most relevant and significant images. So I'm kind of jumping around on this path, but what we've done is they've generated, participants are generating a whole lot of images, they're discussing and reflecting, they're writing up narratives alongside them, and then deciding which images they want to share. I'm sure many of you will be very familiar with the idea of staggered forms of consent. In terms of informed consent processes, this is really crucial in a Photovoice process because often at the outset, participants don't necessarily understand what the process, if they've not done a Photovoice process, they won't necessarily understand what's been asked of them. So ordinarily, at the outset of a Photovoice process, they might give consent just to participate in the workshops, but it won't be at this point here, this part in the path, the editing and the consent, where they actually give consent for their images to be shared and used publicly. So I think there's quite a crucial, again, there's limited time in this presentation to talk about these staggered forms of consent, but it's particularly important with monitoring and evaluation purposes, because for evaluations purposes, you might want access to the full edit for analysis, but then only a smaller edit is the one that is shared publicly. So there are these various kind of levels around what participants may consent to share for different purposes that has to really be considered and planned in advance and discussed with partners, and will very much depend on how Photovoice is being used. So I'm going to skip on from this side, but essentially we've got the taking of pictures, the discussing them, refining the story in a narrative, choosing edits that are available to share or that might be available for the evaluation. Photovoice projects are often culminating in exhibitions or for the images being used in publications, or so that discussion will be happening as well alongside in conjunction with participants, who they want to see their images, why they want to see them. And this goes back to this voice thing. Who is it we want to speak to? What is it we want to say? And then there's a community presentation of those images. And that presentation might just be to other people in their community. It might be to policymakers. It might be to NGO professionals. It might be to a national audience. It might be to another village. You know, the form of those audiences will change dramatically depending on the purpose of the project. So we're coming up to half an hour. I've just got a few images here of Photovoice workshops. And crucially, some of these kind of dialogue exercises, reflection exercises. In the links that I shared, there is a link to something called the Peace Photography Guide. This is a free downloadable resource. It's available in Spanish and French as well as English. In there, there's a lot more detail on different forms of participatory reflection exercises and photo dialogue exercises and different ways that you can do them. But obviously, this is really core of the Photovoice method. And in terms of learning for MEL purposes, this is really invaluable because often a single image can lead to a huge conversation that goes way beyond what's captured in a particular image. So a kind of key thing is to think about how the learning around these photo dialogues can be captured. But what's often happening in these photo dialogues is participants are kind of editing, ranking, selecting images. And in this process, they're kind of refining and discussing the issues at hand. This is a young man I worked with called Onesmus, who's here doing a collage with his images, and he's writing up what's going on in each image. In this other image at the side, I'm sure many of you might be familiar with life mapping. Often pictures can be used then to build life maps or community maps. So this is when, as well, you might consider merging Photovoice as a method with other forms of creative participatory methods or narrative methods to tell stories. So as I've already mentioned, there's this kind of core iterative process that's happening in Photovoice workshops where images are being made in response to a prompt. The conversation and dialogue happens around the images. You know, some of these conversations and dialogue are captured and captions are written, and then the images are shared. And what's really exciting again within Photovoice is that it allows for very personal and private processes, but also for group processes. And these can sit alongside each other, again, depending on the kind of needs and the groups you're working with. But essentially what's happening in these reflections and photo dialogues, this comes from an article that I can share, but it's about this kind of thinking about how images are kind of supporting this Fairerian form of process of critical consciousness, where participants are kind of selecting and defining the course of the conversation, and then in giving context to their images and discussing the meaning of their photographs, they're reflecting on identifying problems and also potentially identifying strengths and solutions to those issues that are being looked at and discussed. This is a really helpful diagram, which I'm going to not do justice to because I'm going to talk about it really quickly, but I do encourage you to go and look at this article. Why I find it really useful is it really clearly communicates how one of the strengths of Photovoice can be in enabling a group process that brings together quite diverse viewpoints on a subject. So that's where this arrow here. So people might be taking pictures that say feeding back to the changes that have happened in relation to a particular program. Now that might be look very different for different participants. And so they might come back with a set of images that are communicating quite diverse experiences. But by looking at all those photos together, and by clustering images or selecting images or reflecting on images, they use the images to kind of structure and define collective themes and issues. So the work around, the image, around the images basically become a vehicle and mediate a kind of a proactive reflective process that allows a group to, I guess, cluster, identify themes, and identify theories and also solutions and potential recommendations as well. So this process of looking and thinking about photos together allows them to come up with a kind of collective interpretation, co-construct meaning, co-construct themes and theories that are then put back out into the world as knowledge and action that can be a catalyst for change, obviously, because there's a participatory action method that is at the kind of core, is how can they then use their images to communicate back out and to enable change. So
Tiffany, sorry to jump in. I think you're aware of the time, but yeah, it's just gone to past.
Huge thanks. So this is another slide that speaks to the data that comes out of projects, Photovoice projects. So you of course have the images themselves, you have the captions that go with the images, but also there's, you know, as I say, the work around these dialogues, any build-up exercises that happened, interviews one-on-one. So many projects will build photo elicitation interviews where they do one-on-one interviews with participants alongside the group work, and that can capture all sorts of valuable forms of data. And in terms of how the data can then be analysed, there's a whole range of methods. Again, I'm not going to go into it because there's a limit on time. But what I want to emphasise is the value of the participatory analysis methods within Photovoice. So here you've got an example where a group of young people in Kenya have looked at a big group of photos, over 50, identified 6 that best represent the issues relating to a particular theme. I think this one was on rubbish, if I'm remembering correctly. And then they are writing captions to go with those, why those pictures are particularly important or relevant. So in the process of kind of editing and creating their exhibition, they're also kind of doing a process of participatory analysis alongside with the researchers, where they're defining the problem, solutions, all these kind of things. And this is another project by Laura Lorenz. And here, I've got it because it's useful here. You see this list down here. These were a set of themes that participants identified, and they identified these themes by doing their own analysis of all their images. So as a group, they generated hundreds of images, and what the participants then did through workshops was identify these, I think there are 8 core themes or 9 core themes that emerged through the images. And then for each of these themes, they made a selection of kind of 10 to 12 images that best spoke to that theme. So here, a group of 12 participants are kind of creating this collective, very plural view, but also coherent in terms of the learning, action, and knowledge that's being shared. So the images become a kind of structure, basically. This slide is just giving you a whole load of images to show the kinds of things that then can be done with the images. And this is often an attraction as well of the Photovoice method, because of course images can tell really powerful stories and can be used in really diverse ways. So I've worked on projects where communities have produced books. I've worked on ones, this is a community archive. Images were built into a community archive where there was concerns around loss of Indigenous knowledge. This here is just a community gathering where young people presented their findings back to adults in the community. This is a kind of temporary exhibition in a refugee camp. Here we've got young children who are living on the streets, publishing their images in a street newspaper. We've got postcards. We've got social media platforms. We've got exhibitions in shopping centres, media work that can be done. So yeah, the kind of potential is endless in terms of how images can be used. It's really kind of, it's about people's imaginations, really.
Tiffany, there are some questions, but they may be touched on by your practical information here, so maybe continue.
Yeah,
and then we see.
Shall I just continue and then there are all sorts of practicalities and logistics that have to be thought about. Photovoice can be a time-intensive method if you're asking participants to get actively involved in analysis and things. So there has to be a lot of thought given to the practicalities of the kind of ask to participants and realistically how much time they can have to be involved. I found consistently, especially working with youth, that Photovoice is a really attractive medium because there's all sorts of skills acquisition that they can benefit from being involved in a Photovoice project. That makes it a really attractive prospect that's relevant to them in terms of communications, learning about digital media. But obviously for older people who are in working jobs, who, I don't know, people who have farms to tend to, children to look after, and don't have less time, there are different ways that the method could be managed to ensure it's less time intensive. Cameras, I've worked on projects that use all types of cameras, from people's mobile phones to little point and shoots to SLRs. There is an equipment element to Photovoice, but when I first started working with Photovoice, we were doing it with little point and shoot cameras and getting the picture. We had to wait for a week to the pictures to be developed in the local photo lab. Now that isn't the case. You can have a portable printer. The costs have gone right down. But of course, people will and can go and shoot 100 images all at once. So there is this kind of data element. So having access to a laptop, having access to hard drives, thinking about how the images are going to be stored, what cameras are most suitable, can you leave cameras in the community if you get cameras, so people could continue using the methods after you've gone? Do people have access to their own cameras? the intergenerational element of it is quite key. Young people might be much more accustomed to using digital technology, older people not so. So all of these things are something to be thought about. I don't know, Richard, are there other practicality questions that have come up that I can speak to directly?
Starting on the time question, Vijita, do you have anything more that you want to, did that satisfy you, that response already? How it can be adapted a little to manage time demands?
Yeah, and I'm also trying to think in terms of an evaluation study where, there is often a very strict time frame to be followed. How does such a method sit? Where does it sit?
Yeah. So in the
Mm.
two case studies, I'm going to give you two quite different examples. So I might hold off and whiz on. In the case study, one of the case study in Ethiopia was with young mothers who had and a pastoral group. So very little time. Their days were very so there. What they did quite cleverly is they combined one group workshop, and then researchers went to the young women's house and did one-on-one interviews. The women had the cameras for 2 weeks and they were taking the pictures alongside their day-to-day, but the researchers did one-on-one interviews with the images, and then they came back for one more group workshop where they all saw each other's images. But that kind of group element where you were asking people to come and gather and give up their day-to-day activities was limited and refined to just 2 or 3 group workshops, and otherwise they worked independently, and that actually worked incredibly well. Also, the photo prompt was very specific. They didn't do any kind of test, like, oh, let's have some fun with cameras and take pictures, which other projects, other participant groups might want to do. They came together for a training, got to use the cameras, and went away with 3 very set prompts that they were taking their pictures around over 2 weeks. So it was done in this much more kind of contained way. I'm going to skip over that.
Could a couple more questions, Tiffany?
Yeah, go for it.
That would be a good moment. One from Nazia echoes I've heard the question from Vijita too, in terms of what about where participants either don't have access to a camera or even a phone that takes pictures, or don't know how to operate one? This
yeah, so
cameras provided, training needed, those kind of questions.
Yeah. So in Photovoice projects, you would normally bring a little stock of cameras. Often, even when people have their own cameras, it's better to do that, because then everyone is using the same camera, and they kind of come to the workshop with that camera. It has the memory card. You can take it out, download the images. There's a kind of ease, I guess, of the logistics that helps. If people are all using different cameras, the quality of the images might come out very differently. That might not matter for evaluation purposes, but if you ever want to use the images in an exhibition or in a report, an evaluation report, the images might look all really different because they're all using different cameras. Another thing to think about as well is the quality of the images. So the image size. If you've got your own stock of little point and shoot digital cameras, you can set in the settings, you can designate the image size, and so that the image files will be big enough to print in a publication or to do a print in an exhibition. If people are just shooting on their own cameras, they might come out with these tiny little files that will serve for evaluation purposes in terms of a dialogue and identifying things, but you might not be able to use the images beyond a conversation in a workshop. So I would say in terms of budgets, it's really useful to buy a stock of cameras. Depending on your group size, participants may share, or you might have enough for everyone to have their own camera, or some people might have decent cameras and then you can provide some to people that don't. Yeah, it really depends.
Super useful practical tips. One more question is, what about where photography is so sensitive, right? And then how do you can you reflect on that? And could you draw images instead? But that was a question from Paul and also Nazia asking about that.
Yeah. So again, the Peace Photography Guide is I'm only flagging it because there's a really good discussion around these kind of ethics and protections and safety issues in there. So given we're shorter time, do go and download that resource, because it has a good discussion there. But of course, well, there are various ways that images can be ethically complex, or doing photo voice as a method can be ethically complex depending on the group that you're working with. There might be protection and safety concerns in terms of if you're working in politically sensitive areas. Obviously, cameras are often viewed as kind of surveillance, a form of surveillance tool, so it might not be possible or appropriate for community members to be out and about photographing in the community. There might be safety concerns with that, or there are obviously protection issues in terms of who's visible in the images, locations and people being identifiable. So that's really what this slide is about, is this those kind of really thinking through the ethics around informed consent and protection are absolutely fundamental to a Photovoice project, and that is before the project starts. And again, I'm going to stop because we've got 15 minutes left. There is lots about it in the piece photography guide, but I'm really pleased you asked the question, because it's a vital part. Images, once they're out in the public domain, are very hard to take back. So the images that are put out and shared have to go through a very rigorous form of informed consent to ensure that all the safety and protection concerns have been thought through carefully, and there have been informed decisions made by the participants, by the people that appear in the images, and all of that. So all of these elements are vital. And again, in resources around Photovoice, you'll see a lot more written about this. And if you go to my website, I've written about it extensively. I've worked with it in a lot of politically sensitive places. I'm just jumping
I don't know if you want one more question now, or keep it to
I'm
the
just
end.
worried that we've got 15 minutes. Or shall I go for one more? And then I'm worried that there's not going to be time for the case studies.
Okay.
The bricolage bit.
I'll throw it at you and you can decide when to have it.
Yeah, go
so
for it.
It's related, because it's a question from Miriam and Phil. Do you ever use closed digital platforms for sharing the images and captions, potentially?
Yes, I have indeed, on various projects for different reasons. So one was a project actually where we were working with young people affected by sexual exploitation and abuse. And so I don't think I even need to explain why a private and closed space was crucial for working with that group. The purpose of Photovoice there was very much about peer support and mentoring, rather than about communicating to a wider group. So I've also worked with another project, a youth project in Bosnia, where young people of different ethnicities were coming together for a central workshop where they did that, but then they were all going back to their homes, and they used closed, actually we used Instagram, but they were closed groups within Instagram, where they would then they did like photo exchanges. We call them photo ping pongs, where they would send a picture, send it back. So the image making became a way for young people to stay in touch with each other and understand a bit more about each other's lives, because that was a kind of reconciliation style program, where it was about supporting young people to build their own capacities as peace actors, but also build their own networks. And so often it goes back to this thing of what the point of the Photovoice, like why Photovoice is being done and with what end, but very much so. I often use closed Facebook groups when participants, there are a lot of great online project models, but when participants, for whatever reason, can't regularly come together and meet, we've done it where participants will upload their images to Facebook and they can comment on each other's images, and that's fantastic. But of course, there are implications for the images being using platforms like Instagram, Facebook, because of course you're losing some of your rights over the image. So that's another element. This slide is really just to emphasize this kind of critical thinking around Photovoice. Photovoice is, there's often a lot of the literature around it is quite romanticized with a lot of participatory methods. I think this is the case. So it's kind of crucial that we think quite critically about Photovoice. Just taking a picture, isn't going to empower people, or you don't inherently understand people's viewpoint by handing over a camera. And there are, as I say, very different forms of photo voice, from quite researcher controlled to community driven and community action versions. So be aware of the spectrum of participation that you will see when you start looking around at photo voice and different applications of it, because there are tokenistic forms of photo voice, as there are much more kind of collaborative, co-produced forms of photo voice. So just kind of be aware of that. This is a summary slide of some of the kind of challenges and limitations as well as opportunities. I hopefully have kind of gone through a lot of that, and it's really just a summary slide. So I'm going to skip because we've got very little time, and I just want to jump to bricolage, because where I've found in photo voice in the last kind of 5-10 years to be particularly exciting is how it can be combined with other methods to create a much more, I guess, kind of, it can be triangulated with other data forms to create a much more kind of bigger picture in terms of what we're learning and understanding about lived experience and community perspectives. This is an example of a project where photo voice was combined with a participatory indicators process. So communities had, there had already been a process where run by the organization, Everyday Peace Indicators, where different focus groups within the community had come together and generated big long lists of community indicators of everyday peace and justice. Through this process, they had essentially created long lists of like 120 different community indicators. And then we came in with photo voice after that the community had gone through that process. And it depended, because we worked in 6 communities. So anything from 12 to 24 participants then came together. And what they did is they made photo stories. They chose particular indicators and made photo stories of those indicators. And the reason why Everyday Peace Indicators decided to bricolage their participatory indicators method with photo voice is they themselves were concerned with how, even though that they were using a participatory method where the communities themselves were generating indicators, they were concerned with the extractive tendencies that were still part of the participatory indicator methods, in part because these huge themes, like let's just take this indicator at the top here. Actually, that's not the best one. Let me go to another one. These huge themes, they're an indicator of coexistence. There are collective work groups among members of the communities, but these huge things were being flattened down to single sentences. And they wanted a way that communities could open back these indicators back out and talk about the stories and the customs, the traditions, whatever the stories are that lay beneath the indicators, that they could open them up again and talk about them within their community. So photo voice was trying to create a means alongside the participant. Also, sorry, the other concern was that participatory indicators were then being used by researchers and analyzed by researchers and being made into surveys, which was then used to try and monitor and track change in terms of the effectiveness of peace building programs. But there was a feeling that the indicators were being created by the community, but then kind of leaving the community. So photo voice was a means to try and ensure that the communities themselves were able to use the indicators to support community level peace building processes and actions. So over a 6-week period, the photo voice group came together. They chose individual indicators and group indicators and produced these photo stories that they then made into big community exhibitions, and all sorts of actions emerged from this whole process. For example, one of the community indicators was about reflecting people's concerns about the state of the local cemetery, which had fallen into a state of disrepair. as you can see from the bottom image. So as a group, the Photovoice group went and documented the state of the cemetery. And in the dialogue around their images afterwards, there was a decision to do a community work group. So over 2 days, they ended up clearing the cemetery. And this directly fed into some of the transitional justice mechanisms that were going on as part of the wider peace processes in Colombia, because of course, a cemetery that had been tidied and organized by the communities enabled a transitional justice mechanism that were looking for and trying to identify graves of missing people and locate remains. It meant that they could come in and do their work much more easily in that particular village and region. So to say, I brought this up is because Photovoice can have these very kind of concrete actions that come out of projects, and the indicators process on its own wouldn't have been able to support those community actions. So here, Photovoice kind of gave this extra layer that allowed for communities, I guess, to use the indicators as a catalyst for community action and change. I'm going to stop there. I mentioned this other case study in Ethiopia with the women who don't have enough time, and I hope I've already referenced it. I can share a blog about that project, which is housed on the IDS website, and follow up. So I think we've only got 5 minutes left, and I don't know, Richard, if there are other questions. I feel like I have
none bubbled up, but if we pause for a
speed.
minute, there's a fantastically rich sharing of your experiences in these examples. There may be some more questions or comments or reactions, how it resonates or not as a
I'd love to
method.
just quickly, just because I've closed and I can see the chat now, Paul's question about alternative methods in restricted areas. There are loads of really creative ways that Photovoice can be used. It doesn't have to be about people going out into their community and taking photos. They can use, they can create images within workshops of important objects, they can role play images. There are all sorts of creative forms of image making where identities can be protected and pictures can be made in closed spaces. And again, Paul, do have a look at the Peace Photography Guide, because that's specifically about using participatory visual methods in post-conflict and politically sensitive settings. There's quite a lot of those case studies where you'll see different strategies that people have used. They're not all Photovoice projects, but you'll see a whole range of methods, and there's 26 case studies on the Imaging Peace website. So between the Peace Photography Guide and the Imaging Peace website, you've got a whole range there. I hope that will speak to some of those methods and strategies.
Thank you, Tiffany. Any further reflections, questions?
Well, I'm sorry for being such an emotional. I get far too yeah. Anyway, I could talk about Photovoice for far too long.
No, don't apologize. Don't apologize.
So.
Alex, do you want to open your mic?
There's a reflection here.
If you feel like it, open your mic and talk us through your comments.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks, Tiffany. Yeah, just a reflection from me. I think I can really see the value in, especially with lots of the work we do, especially with civil society, whether that's campaigners or youth groups or other identity groups and so on, especially when there's elements of co-planning and co-delivery, to use this to try to capture stories from their work, which might otherwise be quite hard to capture without having quite like what could be quite an extractive process of sort of data collection and following up and so on. And I see this as really like embedding into the program methodology in a developmental way, like in terms of a developmental evaluation approach, to help try to capture these stories and inform program adaptation as the program's unfolding, which is, I think, something that could be really valuable.
And one thing I'd say about Photovoice is at different times, it can be harnessed for different ends. So it can be done to do kind of baseline stuff, get people's perspectives or understanding of a particular theme and issue at the outset of a program. It can be used in a kind of traditional evaluation to document change. It can be combined with other narrative methods, storytelling methods. It can generate baseline data that then people return to a year or two later. There's a huge diverse ways that Photovoice can be applied. And what in terms of bricolage, it's often used alongside much more quantitative or survey-based methods, where you've got a method that generates a kind of mass of data over for a kind of bigger group. And Photovoice then works with a more select group, because I mean, this is another could be a strength or a limitation depending on your view of Photovoice. You are often working with smaller groups that aren't necessarily representative of a whole community or a whole. So that's something to be thought about in terms of the bricolage, is how Photovoice can be used alongside other methods. To and the images and indicator article that I put into the chat, that's particularly was a thing within the Everyday Peace project, because the participatory indicators method worked with the community as a whole, and lots of people contributed to that. But the Photovoice group was a smaller element. So it plays these kind
analysis. Mariam and Phil have a question if you have time.
Yes, 1 minute, and then sorry, I've got to run to another meeting, but yes, okay. I'd love to hear.
Just well, I guess more of a reflection in a way, but it seems like, you know, the medium of photography would perhaps push people more towards capturing more physical aspects that they want to talk about. But yeah, do you find that people still do use the approach to capture more of those sort of behavioral and attitudinal changes? I think some of the examples you shared start to point in that direction, but yeah, what's your experience with that?
Yeah, I think that's very much about the approach of the Photovoice facilitators and the spaces that are creative for creative thinking about how photography can be used. You will often find in Photovoice design processes that there are various creative workshops at the outset. So, because participants who haven't used photography in that way might need, I guess, some space and some time to experiment and play with photography, so they can think about how they can use photography to communicate in more metaphorical ways or conceptual ways, because I guess the go-to is to just literally use it to do literal documentation. So again, yes, that's something, and in a wider Photovoice course I would go into that very much about the different forms of images that can be created and the different forms of data that happen as a result. But even with quite clear-cut documentation, the conversations that then can happen about the things that are being documented allow for much more conceptual thinking. I don't know if that speaks to your thing. And I'm really sorry, but I have to run. I really stupidly have a meeting that I have
Tiffany,
to go straight to. But it's been a pleasure.
So much.
Feel free, people can contact me if they have other questions. And
that's very kind of you. Also for the resources. Yeah.
Thank you very much, everyone, and fantastic to meet you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much again.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.